Hey everyone, so glad you could join us for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something I know a lot of you have been curious about, passive learning.
Passive learning. Yeah.
Exactly. We all lead such busy lives these days, so the idea of boosting our English without having to formally sit down and study, well, that's pretty appealing, wouldn't you say?
It definitely has a certain allure to it, but it's more than just a convenient shortcut. There's real science backing up the effectiveness of passive learning.
Oh, really? So we're not just talking about some language learning myth here.
Not at all.
Okay.
It can actually make a significant difference. Some studies suggest it could help you learn up to 30% faster than traditional methods alone.
30% faster.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. But before we get too far, can we back up just a bit? What exactly do we mean when we say passive learning? Is it as simple as just having English radio on in the background while I'm, I don't know, cooking dinner?
Well, that's certainly one way to do it, yeah. But broadly speaking, passive learning is about absorbing information without actively focusing on it. So that English radio, yeah, or maybe watching a movie with subtitles, even just having your phone settings in English, it's all about letting your brain kind of soak it all in without you consciously trying to study.
So is it kind of like, my brain's just this giant sponge and it's just absorbing everything around it? I like that image.
It's a good analogy because our brains are incredible at picking up on patterns, even when we're not consciously paying attention. I mean, think about it. That's basically how we learned our first language as babies. We were surrounded by it, we absorbed it, and eventually we started speaking. We weren't exactly hitting the flashcards at age 2, were we?
That's true. But okay, how does all this background noise, so to speak, actually translate into me, being able to hold a conversation in English?
It's all about neural connections in the brain. Every time you hear a word or a phrase in English, your brain forms a connection. And the more you're exposed to it, even passively, the stronger that connection becomes. Think of it like building a mental pathway. The more you travel down that path, the clearer and easier it becomes to navigate.
So even if I'm not sitting down with a textbook and memorizing verb conjugations, just hearing those words or phrases is still building those connections.
Precisely. You're laying the groundwork. And then when you do sit down to actively study, you'll find that those passively learned elements are already familiar to your brain, making the whole process a lot smoother and faster.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it. Earlier, you mentioned that there's scientific research to support all of this, that this isn't just some new age language learning fad. Can you tell us a bit more about that? What does the research actually say?
Well, we've known for a long time that repetition strengthens memory. But more recent research is showing how this works even during what we might think of as downtime. When you're not actively studying, your brain doesn't just shut off. It's still processing and organizing information, making connections, and even strengthening memories during sleep.
Wait a minute, are you saying I can learn in my sleep? That sounds almost too good to be true.
I wouldn't go that far. It's not like you can plug in some language chip overnight and wake up fluent. But studies are finding that exposure to a language before sleep can improve retention. Think of it like your brain is doing homework while you rest.
Okay, now that is fascinating. It might be time to rethink my bedtime routine. But let's be realistic, I'm not going to just suddenly drop everything and only listen to English podcasts 24/7.
So how much passive learning is enough to actually see results? Is there a magic number of hours I should aim for? That's a great question. And I wish there was a simple answer, a one-size-fits-all formula. But honestly, it's really about finding what works for you in your lifestyle. It's not necessarily about the quantity of exposure, it's more about the consistency.
So you're saying that even short bursts of passive learning sprinkled throughout the day can add up over time?
Exactly. It's about making it a natural and enjoyable part of your daily routine. Take a look at your day, your habits. Where are there opportunities to weave in some English?
I get what you're saying. So instead of mindlessly scrolling through social media in my native language, I could switch over to English language content.
Now you're getting it. Or how about swapping out your usual music playlist for some English tunes? Even just changing your phone's language settings can make a difference. It's all about those small, subtle shifts that over time can make a big impact.
That's actually really encouraging. It feels a lot less daunting than I initially thought. But okay, let's say I'm doing all these things. I'm surrounding myself with English as much as possible. Realistically, I'm probably not going to understand every single word, right? So how much am I really absorbing? Is my brain actually making sense of all this input?
It is. And a perfect example of that is Ahmed. He was a student I worked with who was really struggling to find time for active study. So he started listening to English audiobooks during his commute. At first, he said he barely understood anything. But after a few weeks, he started noticing that he was recognizing words and phrases that he'd never even actively studied.
So just by having that English audio playing in the background, his brain was starting to piece things together. That's pretty amazing.
It is. It's about trusting the process of gradual absorption. Think about it. A baby doesn't suddenly start speaking in perfect sentences. They listen, they absorb, they make connections, and slowly, over time, it all starts to click. Language learning is a lot like that.
That's a great way to put it. So even if I don't understand everything perfectly right away, it doesn't mean I'm not learning. My brain is still working behind the scenes, putting the puzzle pieces together.
That's exactly right. And we're actually going to dive deeper into how to maximize that process, how to leverage the science of how your brain works to make passive learning even more effective.
Okay, I am really excited to hear more about that. So far, we've covered the what and the why of passive learning, how it works, and why it matters. But how about the how? What are some practical steps our listeners can take to start incorporating passive learning into their lives?
That's the perfect place to pick up. And that's exactly what we'll be doing. We need to break down these passive learning methods, really explore each one in detail. And I've got some fantastic resources and tips that I think you'll find really helpful.
This is great. I can't wait to dig into all of that. Okay, so we've talked about what passive learning is and why it's such a powerful tool. Now I'm ready to dive into the how. How can our listeners actually start using passive learning to boost their English?
It's all about finding those natural opportunities to integrate English into your daily life. And, one of the easiest and most enjoyable ways to do that is through listening to podcasts.
Podcasts, yeah. I mean, there are podcasts for literally everything these days, so it's not like you're forcing yourself to listen to something you're not interested in.
That's right. And the beauty of podcasts is that they can fit into almost any part of your day. Whether you're commuting, exercising, doing chores around the house, it's like having a conversation with someone while you go about your day.
You mentioned in my notes that I'm a bit of a history buff. Have I ever tried listening to any history podcasts in English?
I was wondering about that. Have you? There are some amazing ones out there.
To be honest, I usually stick to my native language for those, but I'm definitely open to branching out. Any recommendations?
Oh, absolutely. Have you ever heard of Dan Carlin's Hardcore History?
That name rings a bell, but I'm not sure.
Oh, you should definitely check it out. It's fantastic. He covers these epic historical events in such a captivating way, almost like storytelling. It's a great way to immerse yourself in both history and the English language.
That sounds right up my alley. I'll add it to my list. Okay, what about audiobooks? Are those a good option for passive learning too?
Audiobooks are fantastic, yeah. They're really helpful for building listening comprehension and vocabulary. And again, like podcasts, you can find audiobooks on pretty much any topic you can imagine.
That's true. But I have to admit, I sometimes struggle with audiobooks. I find myself zoning out and realizing I haven't actually absorbed anything.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. It happens to all of us. One thing that might help is to listen while you're doing something else with your hands. Something that doesn't require too much mental focus, like, folding laundry or knitting. It can help to keep your mind from wandering too far.
That's a great tip. I am always folding laundry, so I will definitely try that. Okay, we've talked about podcasts and audiobooks. We also touched briefly on movies and TV shows earlier. I know a lot of people say watching shows in English is helpful, but is it really passive learning if I'm glued to the screen with the subtitles on?
It definitely can be, yeah. Especially if you're focusing on following the story and letting the language kind of wash over you. Think of it as training your ear to the rhythms and sounds of English, getting used to how native speakers sound.
So it's okay if I don't catch every single word.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you can start with subtitles if they help you follow along.
Yeah.
As you get more comfortable, you can try turning them off for a bit, or maybe challenge yourself to watch a familiar show in English without them. You might be surprised how much you understand.
Oh, that's a smart strategy. Okay, so we've got podcasts, audiobooks, movies, and TV shows. Anything else?
Think about how much time we spend on our phones and computers every day. Just changing your device settings to English can be a simple but effective way to get constant exposure to new words and phrases.
That's a good point. I actually hadn't thought about that. It's one of those things that's so simple, but it could really make a difference over time.
Exactly. Those little interactions can have a cumulative effect. It's not just the settings either. You could start following English-speaking accounts on social media like Instagram or Twitter. That way you're exposed to more authentic language, the way native speakers actually use it.
Right. I'm starting to see a theme here. It's all about weaving English into the fabric of my daily life, finding those little opportunities to make it a more natural part of my routine.
You got it. Another great way to do that is through music. Listening to English language music is engaging, enjoyable, and it can really help you internalize the rhythm and pronunciation.
Love listening to music. Though I have to admit, I usually focus more on the melody than the actual lyrics. Any advice for making music a more intentional part of my language learning?
Definitely. I would suggest focusing on one song at a time. Look up the lyrics, maybe translate them if you need to, and really try to understand the meaning behind the words. Then listen to the song again, paying attention to how those words are pronounced and how they fit into the melody. You can even sing along, which is a fun way to practice pronunciation and really get those words into your head.
Turning karaoke night into a language learning session. I love it. But
Yeah.
with all of these passive methods, is there a risk of just passively consuming English without actually learning it? How can we make sure our brains are actively engaging with what we're hearing?
That's a really important point, and it's where active recall comes in. Active recall is all about taking those passively absorbed bits of language and bring them to the forefront of your mind.
Active recall. So what exactly does that involve?
Well, after a passive learning session, take a few minutes to try and recall what you remember. It can be as simple as asking yourself, what were the key points of that podcast? What new words or phrases did I hear in that movie? You could even jot down notes or talk about it with a language partner if you have one.
So it's like testing myself to see what actually stuck.
Exactly. It forces your brain to actively work with the material, which helps to solidify those neural connections and move information from short-term to long-term memory.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like bridging the gap between passive exposure and active learning. Are there any other techniques that can help to make passive learning more effective?
Absolutely. Spaced repetition is another powerful tool. It involves revisiting material at increasing intervals to reinforce what you've learned.
Spaced repetition, right. I've heard that term, but could you explain how it works exactly?
Sure. So let's say you learn a new word while listening to a podcast. With spaced repetition, you would review that word a few hours later, then again the next day, then a few days later, and so on. The idea is to review the material right before you're about to forget it.
So it's like giving my brain those little nudges to keep the information fresh.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It takes advantage of how our brains naturally forget things over time. By strategically timing our reviews, we can interrupt that forgetting process and make those memories stick.
It seems like all of these techniques, passive learning, active recall, and spaced repetition, they all work together to create this really powerful learning system. It's not just about passively consuming content, it's about being strategic and intentional with how we approach it.
You've got it. Passive learning is a valuable tool, but it's not a magic bullet. It's most effective when combined with active learning strategies and a mindful approach.
We've covered a lot of ground today. Different passive learning methods, active recall, and spaced repetition. I'm feeling really inspired and ready to put all of this into practice. But where should I start? What specific resources would you recommend for someone who wants to dive into passive learning?
There are so many great resources out there. And you know what? That's exactly what we're going to explore next. We'll delve into some of my favorite platforms, apps, and websites for passive learning.
Okay, my brain is buzzing with all these ideas. I'm ready to hear about those resources you mentioned. What are some of your favorites?
Well, we were just talking about music, and I think that's a great place to start. Have you ever used Spotify for language learning?
Spotify? Oh, yeah, of course. I use it all the time for music. But are you saying there's more to it than just listening to English songs?
Well, listening to music is definitely a good starting point. But Spotify also has a huge selection of podcasts and even audiobooks now. So you can really find something for every mood and learning goal.
I had no idea. I usually just use it for music, but I'm definitely willing to explore. What kind of music do I usually listen to? Do you have any recommendations based on my taste?
You mentioned you like indie pop and folk music, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, Spotify has tons of playlists curated by genre and mood. You could try searching for indie pop in English or acoustic folk. You might even discover some new favorite artists along the way.
That's a great idea. I love finding new music. What about podcasts and audiobooks? Are there any specific ones on Spotify that you'd recommend?
Oh, there are so many. For podcasts, I really like Stuff You Should Know. They cover such a wide range of topics, everything from science and history to pop culture and psychology. It's really informative and entertaining. And for audiobooks, well, they have a massive library. You could revisit a book you've already read in your native language and experience it in English, or try something completely new.
I love that idea. Reading a familiar book in English would be a fun way to see how much I understand. Okay, so we've got Spotify for music, podcasts, and audiobooks. What other resources would you suggest?
Well, language learning apps can be really helpful for adding a bit more structure and interactivity to your passive learning. Have you ever tried Duolingo?
Duolingo, yeah. I've heard of it. Isn't it kind of like a game?
It is. It uses things like points, badges, and leaderboards to make learning more fun and engaging. And they have a really comprehensive English course that covers everything from vocabulary and grammar to listening and speaking practice.
That sounds pretty cool. I like that they make it into a game. Are there any other apps you'd recommend?
Babbel is another good one. They focus on teaching practical, everyday language, the kind of stuff you'd actually use in real-life conversations. And they use a spaced repetition system, which we talked about earlier. That can be really helpful for remembering what you learn.
Spaced repetition. It seems like that's a key part of effective language learning. Okay, so we've got apps for a more structured approach. What about websites? Any recommendations there?
Oh, tons of great websites. One of my favorites is the BBC Learning English site. They have a wealth of free resources like news articles, videos, grammar lessons, and quizzes. It's all really high-quality stuff.
The BBC? Of course. They're known for their great content. I'll have to check that out. Any other websites you think I should know about?
Voice of America Learning English is another fantastic resource. They have a similar approach to the BBC with lots of news and current events in English, but they also have programs specifically designed for English language learners.
This is fantastic. I'm a little overwhelmed, but in a good way. It's amazing to know that all of these resources are out there.
It really is. And remember, you don't need to use every single resource. It's about finding what works best for you and your learning style. Experiment, explore, and have fun with it.
That's such great advice. I'm feeling so much more confident and excited about my language learning journey now. This whole deep dive has been a real game changer. It's like you've opened up a whole new world of possibilities.
That's wonderful to hear. And remember, it's a journey, not a race. Be patient with yourself, enjoy the process, and celebrate those small victories along the way.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered just about everything today. Any final words of wisdom before we wrap up?
Just one. Never underestimate the power of your brain. It's an amazing learning machine, even when you're not consciously trying. So keep exposing yourself to English in fun and engaging ways, and watch your fluency grow.
I love that. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. This has been incredibly helpful.
My pleasure. Happy learning.
And to all of our listeners, remember, keep those language sponges soaking. We'll see you next time for another deep dive. Happy learning, everyone.